I'm Dr. John Kruse, and I'm talking this week about ADHD and how it makes transitions more challenging. We have a fair amount of data that both on the micro level, on the order of neuronal operating in microseconds, people with ADHD do have trouble making transitions. And we have evidence at the macro level when we make changes in lives, big life transitions, people with ADHD struggle more at those times. And we have much less data where I think most people really live, and that's sort of the day-to-day, minute-to-minute, hour time frame where people need to make transitions from one task or project to another, which is also particularly problematic for people with ADHD. Transitions themselves, it's interesting that of the 18 criteria symptom lists for ADHD in the DSM-5, and on most of the symptom lists that you'll see self-test for ADHD, transitions don't show up there. There's lots of questions about ability to sustain attention, to be locked on and not be pulled away by distractions. There's some on being able to direct your focus to begin with, but there's very little on this changing transition or changes on focus. And we know that that's an important part of focus. So if we think of focus as a spotlight, you need to not just target what you're looking at, you also need to be able to sustain it for as long and track it, follow it, wherever the actor on the stage is. But if then the action goes to character number two, you need to be able to redirect your focus to that second person and then back to the first. So switching attention, switching focus is important part of focus, part of attention, an attribute of it, again, that's not recognized in the formal criteria for ADHD. And yet, again, it's measurably one that causes problems. So at the macro scale, big life transitions, when there's either an increased demand or there's a decreased amount of structure in the person's lives, is often when we see people presenting for treatment for their ADHD. Now, that doesn't mean their ADHD arose at that point. It means that they were able to navigate the systems up until that point, and then either, again, the greater load, the greater challenges of more demands, or less structure, less guidance made their ADHD more problematic. So those transitions are big points. Like the first one is going from a nursery school, preschool, or none of that to a kindergarten or classroom situation. So for many kids, the intellectual demands, the social demands are increased. There may be more structure, but again, there's a discrepancy. More is expected of these kids. It isn't, again, that suddenly at age 5, ADHD showed up. It's that they were able to navigate those previous environments without problems. The next big transitions tend to be school related. So often the demands when people go from middle school to high school, it's more intellectually demanding, more rigorous, more requirements. So kids who might have been smart enough in middle school to get good grades without any studying, without turning in homework, could usually answer the teacher's question if they were paying attention enough to know what the question was. But in high school, again, the demands are increased, and usually there's a little less structure, a little less guidance, a little more moving from classroom to classroom. All your peers may not have the same classes or structure as you, so you can't just copy off of Roger next to you or look at Danny's homework or ask Sally where do we go next? Because she might be going off to gym and you may be off to French class. So then the next transition that tends to be difficult is the transition from high school to college. So again, the demands often go up and the structure goes down. So a few years ago, I had a guy who was failing out of Stanford freshman year. Stanford at the time, and I think it still is tied or close with Harvard as the most difficult college in this country to get into. This kid clearly didn't just suddenly become stupider. That wasn't why he was failing out. He was failing out when we sat down and looked at how did you get through high school? Well, part of how he got through, and he didn't suddenly just develop ADHD. His problem was he got through high school because he came from a culture which valued education, valued family. Mom and auntie sat with him in the kitchen during high school for 2, 3, 4 hours every single day till he got his homework done. Now, they didn't do his homework for him. Again, he was smart enough to get it done, but they made him sit there until that was done. So then he could go play video games or hang out at the mall. When he got to college, there's parties, there's drugs, there's girls, there's alcohol, there's frisbee on the quad, there's all sorts of distractions. And he was failing out because he couldn't structure his time. He couldn't manage the transition to an environment that was more rigorous and less supportive. Then the next big life transition, which often snags people with ADHD, there's some people who are bright enough or their college had either disability services or professors were accommodating and understanding enough what ADHD was. College was negotiable or workable, but the work environment where the bosses either didn't understand ADHD or didn't want to give time or credit or acknowledge that different people's brains may work in different ways. So again, often people feel like, I didn't have these ADHD symptoms before, but usually on checking, you can find that they just either had different ways of compensating for it, or again, there was more structure in the setting. And then the final transition, and I see very few other people writing or talking about this one, is to retirement. And that seems bizarre to most people because clearly the demands drop down from the working world to retirement, but the structure drops even more. So during work, even if you didn't like your job, you pretty much know each day what you're going to do. You may have bosses or coworkers checking in to make sure you're on track doing those things. And retirement, unless you have a spouse that nags you or children around or something that keep you in line, you're on your own. And as I say, one of my mottos is with ADHD, free time is your enemy. And with retirement, that doesn't mean everyone with ADHD does horribly with retirement. Many people who have interesting hobbies or other pastimes that keep them going or enjoy travel, something like that, that can be a wonderful time. But I've seen many people, particularly someone who's 70 or 80 in the retirement years, now grew up in a world where ADHD wasn't even recognized when they were children, much less wasn't recognized when they were adults. So they're dealing often again with the lack of structure, and that transition again is a time many people with ADHD show up. So that's the end of what I'm going to say about the macro transitions in life. There's been a flurry of research on the micro transition level. And by that, I mean looking at what's happening in the brain on a fractions of a second scale. And the big question, or one of the big questions, because part of switching has two different components. One is orienting or responding to the stimuli itself, the perceptual aspects of it, and the second piece is making the executive function decision or the cognitive choice to choose this other alternative, whatever we're switching or transitioning between. And much of the earlier research sort of was unable to separate out those two components. Again, one component is called the perceptual component. So it's dependent upon the features of the stimuli or what's different about what you're switching to. And again, and that's usually considered an unconscious process. The second component of it is considered the intellectual executive function, usually more conscious, cognitive and or choice option where you are choosing to engage or choosing to press the button. So there's been a lot of research in this area, and part of it is due to the proliferation of computers and being able to manipulate or create testing situations where you can separate out different components of what's going on in a switch situation. And this oversimplification is that even though we focus so much on ADHD, at least many of us, including myself, being an executive function process, the bigger, again, on the neuronal brain functioning fractions of a second scale, is that it's actually the perceptual component that people with ADHD aren't as good as picking up. There's a difference here. So the signal as it is getting buried in the noise. There is more discrepancy there between ADHD individuals and neurotypical individuals versus on the cognitive shift, the choosing, the opting to go with the choice that's different. A few other things that are coming out of this sort of fine-grained analysis of switching or transitioning. One is that there's some implication of, again, signal-to-noise ratio issues, and that the lower baseline levels of dopamine or activity in several parts of the brain may be particularly relevant to that, sorting out a signal from the noise. And the encouraging thing is that people with ADHD or even neurotypical brains, both groups of people seem to be able to benefit from training on this task switching. Better yet than just being able to do better on that specific task, some of the studies suggest that practicing switching your attention, and the simplest paradigms are using either a computer setup, either multiple visual stimuli or multiple auditory stimuli, and just having instructions saying, okay, focus on the bird, focus on the clicking fingers, focus on, or if it's visual, on every time my eyebrows raise, or look what's reflected in the window in the background, and getting people to practice switching on command. So the good thing is people's ability to switch quickly improves, and there does seem to be some generalizability. So one of the frequent problems of computer tests or training manuals or protocols is that someone gets better at the specific test you're training them on, but does that really have any relevance? And again, there does seem to be some benefit from shift switching practices. Again, that's where a lot of the research is going, but where people live is more on the minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour, day-to-day switching tasks. And again, it's hard to know how much of this very fine-grained, let's say, neural brain analysis is particularly relevant to there. So when mom checks on Johnny, have you started your homework? Yeah, mom, I've started it. And she goes up 5 minutes later and he hasn't started. And she checks on him 20 minutes later and he still hasn't started. That isn't just a problem of, again, the neural attentional process. It isn't just that Johnny had more trouble detecting the stimuli or what's different from a video game compared to his math homework and then choosing it. A couple of different people brought this up when I was saying I was going to be talking about it. These are adults beyond the school years, but a common parent situation several of them brought up was how difficult it is making transitions like at the end of the day. So they may drive home from work and then sit in their car for 10, 20, 30 minutes because the transition from sort of work brain work mode was much harder for them on a fairly regular basis to move then into their home life. So again, some of that I think is probably these neuronal attentional processes, but I think there's also clearly at least 3 other components or sets of areas we need to be talking about with what makes these transitions difficult. One, I think, is a purely energy fatigue level thing. So there's a good amount of evidence that even though people with ADHD, many of them can hyperfocus, many of them can lock on and attend to a task, they are still probably expending more energy, more brain fire, more activation of the brain. It's not just figuratively or metaphorically tiring. I think they're actually consuming more glucose and oxygen and burning more calories doing that. So then someone else without ADHD or someone without ADHD is knowing how to pace themselves and take breaks. And again, the second component, not just that they're doing more work, but they're probably having less interoceptive feedback from their body, they're less aware of what's going on. So they are more surprised at the end of the day. One, that, oh my God, it's really 6 hours later. I haven't gotten up, I haven't eaten. But they're also less aware that they put in that much work or effort and are more surprised at how unable to move on to the next thing they are. So fatigue, I think, is one factor here. Another one is just anxiety that I think sometimes, again, a work environment, they may enjoy it, they may not, but usually the expectations are fairly more clearly defined depending on the job. But the home situation, there's a much more complex range of interactions with your partner, with your spouse, even your pet, probably than with coworkers who, again, you're usually a narrow range of tasks. So having this greater diversity of up and what to do, that's going to feel more overwhelming. Again, you go into work, you know that you have to check your emails, you have to do this a bit of coding, and you have to talk to these patients, you know what you're doing. When you go home, am I going to be the one making dinner? Are we going to have to be going out to dinner entertaining people? Do I have to choose a movie? Are there taxes to be paid, or is there mail to be responded to? What else? The range is just bigger and more potentially overwhelming. Third factor, I think, is also motivation. So again, if you've been locked on a different topic and thinking in that way, and you're facing something new, which feels like an interruption and something alien, it's often hard to remember this also is something that I've probably added to my life and want to have in my life. But it's so disparate from what I've been doing that it's hard to get in touch with why you might want to do it, rather than just why you should or why it's obligated or why people are expecting you to do it. Sort of less rigorously studied, but sort of clinical approaches to how do we deal with those transition periods. One is a simple sort of clearing the mind, counting down, so if you've driven home from work and you aren't ready to go in and open the door, just can you simply count down from 30 and focus on your breathing while you're doing so? Is that enough to clear out the residue from the day? If it needs more of a transition, more of a clearing out, then there's sort of two almost opposite directions to go. One is exercise. Exercise is really potent at shaking things up, breaking up perspective, clearing the mind, invigorating many people. Rather than sitting in your car for half an hour, going for 5 minutes walking around the block, or deciding to walk up the 3 flights of stairs rather than waiting for the elevator, may be an effective way to help you move past the previous task and feel ready and engaged for the next task. The direction opposite from exercise is meditation. And this is going to be a gross oversimplification, but if we have 3 general modes that our brain can be in, so one is called the default mode, where we are ruminating, we're focused inward, we're focusing about ourselves, often worrying about what's to come or lamenting what we've done. So it's autobiographical, inner focused, often negative worrying mode. That's one way our brain can be. A second way is an interactive salience mode, interacting with our environment, doing things, producing things, working on a task. But a third, and often again, either on the ride home, we may be locked in this default mode network where we're ruminating about the active state we were in before. The third and different mode is the meditative mode. So it actively deactivates the default mode network. And we're one of the quickest, and my favorite mode of getting into a meditative state is chanting or repeating a mantra, because you don't need complete silence. It's a little faster and easier than just trying to clear your mind or do other things. There's a talk on mantras earlier on this YouTube channel. 4th or 5th, I'm not sure where we are, angle or approach to dealing with switching into these new state or new task you're about to is, again, getting in touch with why you want to do it. So often when we're switching, we're faced with feeling overwhelmed, why it feels we have to do this, expected of it, we should be doing it, all the sort of social obligations, needs, demands of others, oughts, shoulds come in. And it's often really hard for people to remember, wait a minute, this is a part of my life that I'm getting something positive out of, I want to do. So trying to remember why you would want to do it, why you enjoy doing it, either immediate benefits from that, or if it's something like going to the gym, where some people get immediate benefits, some people feel invigorated, but some only appreciate they're losing weight, they're changing their body shape, they're getting stronger, they're seeing more longer term goals. So either your wants, your desires, what motivates you can be either short term or long term, but getting in touch with those is a way to help switch into the new task that you're about to do. That's about all I'm going to say tonight. There's a question, do all people with autism have ADHD? According to chiropractor neurologist I spoke with, that is the case. So one of my previous talks is about autism and ADHD. So what we know is statistically, what we'd say, these are often comorbid. So beyond random chance, there are more people who have ADHD who also meet criteria for autism, and there's more people than you would expect, and more people with autism who have ADHD traits. But clearly you can have ADHD without fitting at all on the autism spectrum, and clearly you can have autism without ADHD. So no, they are not the same. One of my pet peeves is I think how often people are being misdiagnosed right now with autism when they really have ADHD, or they really have PTSD, or they really have social anxiety disorder. So that the three criteria, and again, there's a spectrum of severity, but for autism, one realm is social deficits. And social deficits doesn't mean shyness or awkward. I mean, you can be shy or awkward, but it's that the social domain is not even being processed in the same way or with the same salience. So it's often more obliviousness to the social cues or social graces. It's not being worried that people aren't going to like you because you're awkward or weird. Social deficits are one. Two domain is what are called stereotypical repetitive behavioral movements, and it can be hand flapping, it can be rocking, it can be more extreme movements. Again, that is, you need something in that dimension for an autism diagnosis. And the third is having interests or pastimes that are highly repetitive, they can be intricate, but they are sort of superficial and disconnected from the context. So it's not just an interest in old cars and refinishing cars. It might be collecting license plates that end in the number 4. Again, without particular care or interest in what state they're from or who drove that car or how old it is or anything about the context or meaning. It's a superficial, often numerical emphasis. If you have input as to other topics you want me to talk about, let me know, and stay healthy, stay happy.